Elisa Lam booked one of the most infamous hotels in the world, and she never left. This disturbing elevator footage is the last known recording of her alive. Some theories suggest she wasn't alone, even though no one else appears on camera. Others believe the footage itself was tampered with. The timestamps skip, the timing doesn't add up, and the video was released only after police had already reviewed it. So the question isn't just what happened to Elisa Lam, it's whether someone else was involved and hidden in plain sight. But before we get there, we need to understand why Elisa was even in Los Angeles and what may have started unraveling long before the elevator doors opened. Who Elisa Lam really was. Before Elisa Lam became a mystery, she was very visible online. She ran a Tumblr blog under the username Etherfields. It wasn't polished or curated. It was raw, emotional, and brutally honest. She wrote about feeling disconnected from people, struggling with expectations, anxiety, depression, and her bipolar diagnosis, wanting to disappear, but also wanting to be understood. What's important here is this. Elisa didn't hide her inner world, but she also didn't hint at suicide. In fact, she often wrote about wanting to get better, to travel, to reset her life. Her posts during the trip were active, normal, observational, which is why her disappearance shocked people who followed her online. Nothing in her writing suggested she planned to vanish. If anything, it suggested the opposite. She wanted to be seen. Why Elisa was traveling and why alone. She had paused her university studies and planned a solo trip down the West Coast. She documented her journey online, writing openly about identity, pressure, and mental health. This part matters because it explains why she trusted strangers in unfamiliar places. Los Angeles wasn't random. It was affordable, busy, anonymous, and the Cecil Hotel was cheap. What Elisa likely didn't understand was who else stayed there. The Cecil Hotel, a place people disappear into. By the time Elisa Lam arrived in Los Angeles, the Cecil Hotel wasn't just infamous, it was unstable. On paper, it was a budget hotel. In reality, it was something else entirely. The Cecil functioned as a strange hybrid, part hotel, part long-term housing. Some guests stayed a night or two, others lived there for months, even years. Full-time tenants shared hallways with tourists who had no idea who they were sleeping next to. Many residents were people with nowhere else to go. Some struggled with addiction, some with severe mental illness, some had criminal records, some were simply trying to disappear from their past. And in that environment, nothing really stood out. Police were called to the Cecil constantly, not for one big dramatic incident, but for everything. Disturbances, violence, drug activity, welfare checks, deaths. So often that officers treated it like background noise. That's important, because it means strange behavior didn't raise alarms and people learned not to ask questions. The building itself didn't help. Long hallways, poor lighting, broken locks, fire escapes that could be accessed without much effort. This was a place where someone could follow you, and no one would notice. So when Elisa Lam walked through those doors, she didn't enter a normal hotel. The bookstore often skipped. On January 31st, just hours before she vanished, Elisa Lam visited the last bookstore in downtown Los Angeles. Staff later confirmed that Elisa was friendly, engaged, and completely normal. She was concerned about how heavy the books would be in her luggage because she was still traveling. She leaves the store appearing calm and functional. She returns to the Cecil Hotel, and within hours, she is captured on that elevator camera behaving in a way that would later disturb millions. The hotel. Back at the Cecil, Elisa was initially placed in a shared room. Her roommates complained about her behavior, not violent, but intense, unpredictable. She was moved to a private room. Important detail. This was not unusual for the Cecil. Staff were used to strange behavior. Complaints didn't trigger investigations. The elevator footage terrifying until you understand it. When people first see the elevator footage, it looks like something out of a horror movie. Elisa steps inside, presses multiple buttons, moves to the corner, peeks into the hallway, steps out, gestures with her hands, as if speaking to someone who isn't there. It feels supernatural, like she's reacting to someone we can't see. But here's the part that changes everything. Elisa Lam had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder. Toxicology suggested she was not taking her medication before death. For someone with bipolar disorder, especially during a manic or psychotic episode, the shift can be sudden, severe, disorienting. Being chatty and completely normal at the last bookstore just hours earlier, that doesn't contradict a breakdown. It actually fits. Manic episodes can escalate quickly. Paranoia can intensify within hours. Now watch the footage again with that in mind. She looks terrified. She keeps checking the hallway as if someone might be there. She presses multiple elevator buttons, possibly trying to escape to any floor that will open first. And here's a detail most people miss. She appears to press the door hold button repeatedly. That means the elevator doors wouldn't close. Not because someone was blocking them, not because it was malfunctioning, but because she accidentally kept the doors open herself. Imagine being in a paranoid state, believing someone is after you, trying to get the elevator to close so you can get away. And it won't close, because you're the one preventing it. That would escalate fear instantly. She may have believed someone was holding the door, someone just out of frame, someone she couldn't see clearly. At the end of the footage, after she leaves, the elevator finally begins stopping at multiple floors because she pressed nearly every button. What looked like something sinister may have simply been panic unfolding in real time. And that's what makes it more disturbing than any conspiracy theory, because there may never have been anyone there. Only a young woman, convinced there was. And then there's the timestamp issue. The footage that was released to the public looks low quality. The numbers appear distorted. Some frames seem slightly slowed down. For years, people have claimed this proves the video was edited, that something was removed. But there's a far more mundane explanation. The LAPD didn't release the original raw surveillance file. They released a compressed copy, exported from an older hotel security system, and then processed again for public distribution. Security systems in 2013 often recorded at low frame rates. When that footage is converted, duplicated, or uploaded, timestamps can blur, skip frames, or appear misaligned. In other words, what looks like manipulation may simply be compression artifacts from outdated surveillance technology. It's not cinematic editing, it's cheap security hardware. And while that explanation is less thrilling, it's also far more consistent with how these systems actually work. When the water started tasting wrong, for several days no one at the Cecil Hotel reported Elisa Lam missing, which is not that weird. She was traveling alone. She had a private room. The only people who realized something was wrong were her parents, back in Canada. When she stopped calling them, that's what triggered the missing person report. Police searched the hotel, but at that time, nothing was found. Then guests began complaining. The water pressure was weak. The water looked darker than usual and tasted strange. People were showering in it, brushing their teeth with it, drinking it. Maintenance was finally sent to check the rooftop water tanks. The Cecil used 4 large cylindrical tanks to supply water to the building. Each one stood several feet tall, industrial, sealed with heavy lids. When a worker climbed up and opened one of them, he saw Elisa Lam's body floating. She was naked. Her clothing was in the same tank. There were no signs of physical trauma, no obvious defensive wounds. The lid had been closed. That detail is what reignited every conspiracy theory. Because if she climbed in herself, someone would have had to close the lid after. Unless, as some investigators later suggested, the lid had not been fully secured and had shifted back into place. But in that moment, none of that mattered. The disturbing elevator footage suddenly had an ending. And it was worse than anyone expected. The roof. How did she get there? The hotel manager initially stated that the roof doors were locked and alarmed, but former guests later contradicted that. Several people who had stayed at the Cecil said the fire escape access wasn't as secure as management suggested. There were multiple possible routes to the roof: the fire escape stairs, external fire ladders, maintenance access points. So the idea that it was impossible for her to get there alone doesn't really hold up. The water tank, could she have climbed in? The tanks were large industrial containers, roughly 8 feet tall. They weren't smooth vertical cylinders with no grip. There were pipes, metal framing, and structural elements around them. Investigators later demonstrated that climbing up wasn't unrealistic for a young adult in a heightened emotional state. The lids were heavy, but not sealed shut. And here's a detail often misunderstood. At least one of the tanks was reported to have been open when Elisa was found. If she climbed in during a paranoid episode, she may have closed the lid herself, instinctively trying to hide. Or, if it was left partially open, gravity and wind could have shifted it back into place. Nothing required a second person. Why were her clothes off? This is where people immediately jump to foul play. But there is a well-documented phenomenon called paradoxical undressing. In extreme distress, whether from hypothermia, panic, or psychosis, people sometimes remove their clothing irrationally. There were no signs of assault, no bruising indicating restraint, no defensive injuries. Her clothes were found in the same tank. That suggests disorientation, not violence. When you remove the internet noise, what remains is something much more grounded. The most likely explanation is that this was a tragic mental health crisis. Severe manic or psychotic episodes can escalate rapidly, especially under stress, isolation, and lack of sleep. In that state, paranoia can feel absolutely real. If she believed someone was after her, every action that night makes sense. But if you want to know something really strange, there was a movie released in 2002 called Dark Water. In that film, a young woman moves into an old, deteriorating building with a troubled history. The building has constant water issues. The water becomes discolored. There are complaints about strange smells and leaking ceilings. Eventually, it's revealed that a body is inside the building's rooftop water tank, contaminating the water supply. Over a decade before Elisa Lam. Explain that.